economics, education, entertainment, labor, law, politics, religion, sex, and war. If you do not understand racism, which is white supremacy, what it is and how it works, everything else that you understand will only confuse you. Confuse you. Confuse you. Confuse you. Confuse you. If you do not understand, confuse you. If you do not understand, confuse you. If you do not understand, confuse you. Confuse you.
My definition of white supremacy and racism, I use those two terms as synonyms. I use the same definition for both terms. That definition is as follows: a global system of people who classify themselves as white and are dedicated to abusing and or subjugating everyone in the known universe whom they classify as not white.
Economics, education, entertainment, labor, law, politics, religion, sex, and war.
We're coming to get our check.
This is not a test. This is your emergency broadcast system announcing the commencement of the annual purge sanctioned by the U.S. government. Weapons of Class 4 and lower have been authorized for use during the purge. All other weapons are restricted. Government officials of ranking 10 have been granted immunity from the purge and shall not be harmed. Commencing at the siren, any and all crime, including murder, will be legal for 12 continuous hours. Police, fire, and emergency medical services will be unavailable until tomorrow morning at 7 a.m. when the purge concludes. Blessed be our new founding fathers and America, a nation reborn. May God be with you all.
They are real good at killing. That's the point that I'm making.
We're coming to get our check.
This is Planet Money from NPR.
In the mid-90s, there was this big new economic theory that was all the rage. It was an idea for how countries can produce unlimited economic growth, which is kind of the whole point of economics. You know, growth means less poverty, more prosperity.
For decades, economists had said there are basically just two ways to make an economy grow: invest in capital or in labor, in tangible mundane things like factories and workers, which means growth is ultimately limited because there are just so many people you can hire or factories you can build.
But then some economists, most notably Paul Romer, said, actually, there's a third way to grow: innovation. And before this, people thought of innovation as a sort of mysterious force that kind of comes and goes at its own discretion.
Paul Romer said, actually, you can make innovation happen. Innovation is just like a factory you can build. All you have to do is, invest in science education, promote market competition, and most importantly, pass strong patent laws so that ideas can be protected and monetized. Just do these things, pass those laws, and innovation will follow.
And people loved this idea. Paul Romer eventually won the Nobel Prize in economics for it, and he taught it to an entire generation of economics students.
But one of those students, a PhD candidate named Lisa Cook, as she learned about this, she thought, I'm not sure it's that simple. Just pass patent laws, get innovation?
No. No, it won't work that way. No. It seemed naive. Build it and they will come. And that's not how it works. You can have laws on the books and not enforce them and never have growth.
Lisa Cook was skeptical in part because of personal experiences. For one, she'd spent some time in Russia. She was studying the banking system there in the 1990s. And at the time, Russia technically had patent laws. But what they didn't have was a lot of innovation.
And to Lisa, the reason seemed clear. Like, sure, there were laws, but no one seemed to enforce them. For example, several of the bankers she was supposed to interview disappeared mysteriously. She was scared just walking to work.
If I don't get, hit by a moving object falling out of a window or, attacked on the street, like, I'm lucky.
If you're afraid for your life, you're probably not inventing things.
Also, Romer's big innovation theory assumes that the law is enforced equally. And Lisa knows very personally, for example, from her childhood in Georgia, that equal treatment is not guaranteed.
Yeah, I mean, I was desegregating schools along with my sisters, and I was beaten. I was beaten up. I still have scars from that scar where hair won't grow in my eyebrow, and a scar on my leg from having been beaten during the period of desegregation.
So Lisa is pretty sure she's found a blind spot in the hot new economic theory. She suspects that there is more to fostering innovation than just science schools and patent laws. Maybe innovation also requires safety and equality.
To test her hunch, she needs to find a pool of inventors where some were subject to violence and inequality and others weren't. She thinks, now where could I find such a data set?
So, of course, knowing a little bit about American history, I knew that African American inventors were subject to the things that started happening to African Americans around the period of the end of Reconstruction, when lynchings were largely at their peak, and when segregation laws were being put into place and thereafter.
And this is how Lisa Cook decided to study the very things that people are protesting right now. Violence against Black people and the unequal enforcement of law, and whether those things stunt innovation.
All she had to do was gather a bunch of data, plug it into a formula, and she'll have her answer. Simple.
And it was nowhere near that easy.
Hello, and welcome to Planet Money. I'm Mary Childs.
And I'm Karen Duffin. Today on the show, Lisa Cook sets out to investigate whether one of the most important theories in economics is missing something. If she's right, it would have implications for the wealth of Black Americans and also for entire economies.
She would spend more than 10 years creating new data sets from scratch, teaching basic American history to her colleagues, and shining a light on one of the biggest blind spots in economics.
So, they are real good at killing. That's the point that I'm making.
We're coming to get our check.
Lisa Cook has this hunch that one of the most important ideas in economics has a big hole in it. To test her theory, she needs a way to measure exactly how violence and a lack of rule of law, how that impacts innovation. She needs concrete data, things she can count.
For innovation, there actually is a way to count ideas, patents on inventions. There's a whole database of patents going back centuries. So, okay, she's got that side of it.
And to measure violence and unequal rule of law, she uses a range of markers, from segregation laws to the most extreme example, lynchings.
She'll look at data from 1870 to 1940 and compare the number of patents filed by Black and white inventors. If Black inventors file fewer patents during periods of increased violence and lawlessness, and they file more patents when violence and lawlessness decrease, then she's proven it. She's right.
The thing that I was deluded about was that all these data were just hanging around and available. Like, patents were not searchable. There was no Google patents. Race is not recorded on a patent record.
Yeah, the most critical information that Lisa needs, the race of inventors, that is not listed on patents. In fact, the only patent filing that does list race is one of the earliest granted to an African American. It was a man named Norbert Rillieux. He invented an evaporator that's used in sugar production in 1843. And the reason the patent file notes his race is because someone tried to take it from him because of his race.
The person was living on a plantation in New Orleans, and they thought that it was an illegitimate patent because enslaved persons couldn't receive patents.
Beyond that, Lisa will have to, patent by patent, figure out a way to identify the race of each filer for the 2 million patents filed in that 70-year period.
So she starts looking for common African-American names in census records, which do list race, so she can cross-reference those with the patent records.
One theory about black names was that African Americans named themselves after a president.
She checks it out.
Well, it turns out all Americans name men after presidents.
She also combs through historical newspaper articles, scholarly papers, biographies, also a surprisingly useful source.
If African Americans were working for a government entity and that entity was completely secret, like the Department of Defense, and we wouldn't know about that person's inventions. But in their obituaries, their family could talk about that person's inventions, and they did. X was a great inventor of some sort.
The place where she finds the most data is in a survey that was commissioned by the U.S. Patent Office and W.E.B. Du Bois. They'd wanted to showcase African-American inventions at the 1900 World Fair.
It took me a year to identify the names and then a year to match them to the data, and then another year to fail at that.
She ends up with a list of 726 patents filed by African Americans between 1870 and 1940. Finally, she has all the data she needs to start testing her theory.
So she plots out the number of patents filed per year chronologically on a graph. And staring at them all lined up, she can look back in time and see how Black innovation grew or fell in different times and places throughout this history.
Starting at the beginning of her data set in 1870. The Civil War was receding in the background. The 14th Amendment had recently passed, promising equal protection under the law for all men born in the United States.
During this period, African Americans made a lot of gains, holding office, owning property, and filing more and more patents. She sees the line on her graph rise. African Americans filed patents at roughly the same rate as white inventors through about 1900.
Given this new freedom and new rights, African American inventors flourished. They invented all kinds of things in this period: an elevator, rotary engines, a tapered golf tee, a dough kneader, a telephone system, a fertilizer distributor, and a bunch of other things.
But then, as Lisa followed the patent line further, the story her data set was telling her took a turn.
There was a sharp decline in patenting right at 1900, around the time of Plessy versus Ferguson and thereafter.
Plessy versus Ferguson, the Supreme Court ruling that gave official legal sanction to a so-called separate but equal America. Legislators were passing laws that pushed African Americans into not at all equal homes and schools, or just cut off access to things altogether, including things that you would need to invent.
They've been locked out of libraries where they used to go check the patent registries. They are locked out of the commercial districts where their patent attorneys are. They were cut off from talking to other inventors. I think that was one of the biggest casualties.
For those who were still inventing, they had to go to extreme lengths. Like she found this one guy, Garrett Morgan. He invented a precursor to the gas masks used in World War I, also hair straightening cream, a better stoplight.
But he couldn't sell all of those things himself, so he had to find a workaround. At the time, Lisa says Native Americans held a special prominence as inventors of medical remedies and clothing and boats. So Garrett would go to trade shows with a sort of cover story.
He would bring along a Native American, and he'd have the Native American sort of give the pitch, and he was the Native American's research assistant. That's how he would present himself.
But for a lot of African American inventors, after Plessy versus Ferguson, they just straight up lost their jobs, including one of the top patent officers at the U.S. Patent Office, also a top inventor at the U.S. Postal Service, who was in charge of coordinating with other inventors around the country. Neither of them ever filed a patent again.
And as Lisa connects the fluctuations in patent filings to specific spikes in lynchings or new segregation laws, the data seem to be confirming her hypothesis.
But then she sees another big dip in the patent filings from African Americans, and this one does not appear connected to lynchings or segregation laws.
And I couldn't get rid of the effect. Like you have to test when you're looking at something that is that stark. You have to test adjacent years to see if you are seeing what you're thinking you're seeing. And I just couldn't get the effect to go away no matter what I threw at it.
Her data were screaming at her that something big had happened in 1921. She couldn't scrub it out as a calculation error, no matter how many times she checked.
She looks into it and realizes that 1921 was the year of one of the worst incidents of racial violence in American history, the Tulsa Race Massacre. If you've seen Watchmen on HBO, this was the attack on Black Wall Street.
This one neighborhood in Tulsa had become famous as a bustling, affluent community, a place where Black Americans could settle and live well. It had its own newspaper, its own hospital, schools, banks, a bus service. But in late May of 1921, mobs of white men invaded the town. They massacred residents, shooting on sight. They also firebombed the neighborhood from airplanes. This haven of Black affluence burned to the ground.
Tulsa demonstrated that no one would help them. No one. The local government failed. The state government failed. The U.S. government failed. At every single level, nobody had their backs. They were all afraid.
It was a message that was heard across the country. The government would not provide even the most basic protections for Black Americans. Not for their lives, not for their property, so certainly not for their inventions.
It's a sense of personal security. I don't feel safe anywhere. But also, my livelihood might be in jeopardy. I may never be able to make a living doing the things I'm doing. So that's why if I'm a Black inventor in another city, why would I ever invent anything if I thought the intellectual property was never going to be defended? If the Black Wall Street that everybody knew about, if it weren't protected, why would I be protected?
So it shouldn't be surprising that after that, patent filings by African Americans dropped off. Not just in Tulsa, not just in the South, but across the country.
As Lisa traced the graph from the beginning of her data in 1870 through the Plessy ruling, the Tulsa riots, and up to 1940, she saw a consistent trend.
The divergence between white patenting and Black patenting was just so stark.
When she does the final math, she finds that the United States had lost out on more than 1,100 inventions from Black inventors.
And there's no real way to quantify what those things might have been, the things that never got invented. But Lisa says that looking at some of the inventions that narrowly did make it into the world gives us a window into what we almost lost.
She thinks about her own cousin, Percy Julian. He was the first African American to head a major corporate laboratory. And in 1940, he invented an improved way to make cortisone, an anti-inflammatory steroid.
Now, this is a major medical advance. I don't think I know anyone over the age of 20 who hasn't used cortisone. His house was firebombed twice. We wouldn't have that if they had been successful, if whoever firebombed his house had been successful. So it's not an abstract idea.
What's even less abstract is the economic impact of all those lost inventions.
The number of patents that were lost would be equivalent to that of a medium-sized European country at the time.
Wow.
Whoa.
An entire Netherlands.
So Lisa has found the gap in the innovation theory that she had suspected might be there. The idea that if we just make strong patent laws that innovation will come. Her data show it's true for some people, not true for others.
She's pretty sure that she's sitting on findings that have huge implications. For African Americans, most directly, because this cuts them off from an important source of wealth, but also for the wealth of entire nations.
So she starts putting her findings in front of respected economists. She takes it to Milton Friedman, the Nobel Prize-winning libertarian economist who had written about how the market, unchecked, will solve discrimination.
When I walked in the door and sat down, he said, "Young lady, you've got to publish this. This is one of the best ideas I've seen in the last generation. You've got to publish this." And I was just taken aback because, economists are not known for being effusive.
She sends her paper to Paul Romer and 2 other Nobel Prize winners, Ken Arrow and George Akerlof. They all say, yes, publish this. So that's 3 Nobel Prize-winning economists saying, this is important. You have to tell people.
After the break, Lisa finds out how hard it is to innovate within economics.
So, they are real good at killing. That's the point that I'm making.
We're coming to get our check.
To get an academic paper published, it has to get through a panel of experts who read and critique it. If you make edits to their satisfaction, maybe they will publish it.
She sends her paper to some of the major economic journals. And what she'd expected to come back was feedback about her methodology, assumptions, specific equations, things in the paper. But instead,
most of their questions were about U.S. history. They weren't about the econometrics. They weren't about the underlying economics. The thing that I was shocked at, the most, was that people in economics didn't know U.S. history.
Her readers seem to be getting bogged down in these questions about definitions. Like, a lot of people asked, what is a former slave?
That I got that question just took me aback. And I sent it to, my senior colleagues, is this asking what I think it's asking? You interpret this for me. Please, I might be missing something. There may be some nuance here that I don't get.
Also, she had used the words lynchings and extrajudicial killings interchangeably in the paper. And journal editors would ask, do lynchings really count as extrajudicial killings?
I kept getting this question. Change it. Not even there's a debate to be had. Change it. Just change it. Because we don't think this applies here. Extrajudicial killings happen to white people and to people in developing countries or in emerging markets. This is lynchings are something different.
And granted, debating definitions is a normal part of the academic publishing process. But the questions she's getting also felt to Lisa a little like they were debating American history and ideals across the divide of the black and white experience. Like the question she got the most. Many of her readers kept asking, wait, how would a local lynching affect a would-be inventor across the country?
Why would you care about a lynching that happened in a different state? Why would you care? The kind of fear and terror that black people knew then and that they know now was not even fathomable. It was unimaginable. And this was post Rodney King. So I was flabbergasted. Why would you not care? And I thought, oh boy, I'm in trouble.
So she basically wrote a Black history paper on top of her econ paper, spelling out the effect of racial violence as it rippled through Black communities across the country.
Lisa says it usually takes 2 to 3 years for a paper to be published. But for her paper, it took 10 years of critique and revision and debate, also support from her Nobel Prize-winning colleagues, before her research was published in the Journal of Economic Growth in 2014.
It shouldn't take all that. It really shouldn't. It shouldn't take, 3 Nobel laureates to rescue the idea and then show up and do, hand-to-hand combat.
The field of economics prides itself on its detachment, on its ability to set aside the noise and chaos of human behavior and explain things in cold, hard data, in models and equations.
But as Lisa's research showed, if you aren't putting all of the variables into these equations that you're using to explain the world, maybe because you haven't learned about those things or lived them, or you don't believe they even exist, if you're missing a variable, you'll get the wrong answer.
And that goes back to the fundamental equation. If there is something that impedes the rate of arrival of ideas, you're going to slow down the economy. It's not just for that period, and it's not just for Black people. This is a cautionary tale for all economies.
A cautionary tale that America does not seem to have fully learned yet. Lisa extended her initial dataset through 2010 to see how far things had come.
1899 was the peak year for African American patents per capita. It still is. So that has not returned.
Really?
That is still the peak per capita for African Americans.
A few weeks ago, Lisa Cook got promoted to full professor. There are more than 9,000 full professors of economics in the country. About 20 of those professors are Black.
No one. The local government failed. The state government failed. The U.S. government failed. At every single level, nobody had their backs.
So, they are real good at killing. That's the point that I'm making.
We're coming to get our check.
You are now listening to P.A.R. That's People Activity Radio, and I'm your host, JohnGHorse. Welcome. You have found your family in a peaceful place. P.A.R. is a family-friendly information distribution program seeking to inform non-white people, in particular, Black classified, and assisting at counter-racist codification.
We're coming to get our check.
The title of today's episode is Honoring Our Warriors, Episode 3. Dr. Francis Cress Welsing and Dr. Lisa D. Cook. The administrative duties of producing justice. I'm going to say the title one more again. The title of today's episode is Honoring Our Warriors, Episode 3. Dr. Francis Cress Welsing and Dr. Lisa D. Cook. The administrative duties of producing justice. Let's get it in. Yes, indeed. Where do we begin? And this is P.A.R. People Activity Radio, and I am your host, JohnGHorse. Welcome. You have found your family in a peaceful place. And that extremely informative clip I found on NPR, an NPR produced show called Planet Money, and the title of that interview of Dr. Lisa Cook is called Patent Racism. Extremely informative in removing confusion as it pertains to the global system of racism, white supremacy, white terror domination, as Dr. Kamal Kambon calls it, and or systematic anti-blackness. Let's move on. And of course, today we are talking about honoring warriors. And when we are talking about warriors, we're talking about warriors in all areas of people activity. And in particular, information distribution or education. That era, that sector of people activity is also dominated by people who classify themselves as white, and we believe in racism, white supremacy. That being said, whenever a scholar subject to black classification uses their time and life energy producing theories, producing papers, producing literature,
We're coming to get our
informing non-white people on how the system of racism, white supremacy affects them by way of the past, present, and future. They are actually putting their livelihoods on the line and sacrificing themselves in order to inform their group. And when I say their group, I am talking about the group that is subject to non-white, in particular, black classification. And that is how we have been inspired to do this particular episode, illuminating, placing on a pedestal two Queen Mother warriors. One, the late, great Dr. Frances Cress Welsing. Number two, the focus of the Planet Money interview on NPR, Dr. Lisa D. Cook. Let's get it in. Now, you're going to ask me, why are you talking about Dr. Frances Cress Welsing and Dr. Lisa D. Cook in the same breath, JohnGHorse? And I'm going to answer that. See, when you're talking about warriors, when you're talking about fighters, when you're talking about liberators, you understand you got to always involve all areas of people activity in the area of education. We have had many a warrior, and under that context, we talk about some warriors. Now, these two just so happen to be female, classified as black under the system of racism, white supremacy, so that would qualify them as victims of the global system of racism, white supremacy, be it that they are extremely gifted, extremely talented, extremely touched victims, nevertheless, still victims. Now, we all know here, if you are a frequent listener of People Activity Radio, that John G refers to codification, and John G gets those codification references from a brother by the name of, the elder, an elder by the name of Neely Fuller Jr., who wrote the Independent Compensatory Code concept for victims of racism, white supremacy. Now, under that context, I'm just going to go out and try to give a little story the best I can. There's not a lot of information about this story, but from my research, this is the information I know. This all may not be true, and I'm quite sure there are more qualified individuals to give the correct information on this story, but I'm going to take a whack at it from what I could gather. And if I am in error, I apologize in advance. And I'm going to tell you a story about sweet Queen Mother, Dr. Frances Cress Welsing, because in my opinion, there would be no independent compensatory code concept for victims of racism, white supremacy, written by Neely Fuller Jr. Had he not been coached, had he not been directed, had he not been inspired by a young woman named Dr. Frances Cress Welsing. Yes, indeed. Yes, I said it. Now, as I understand it, Victims of racist white supremacy have been suffering mistreatment at the hands of the dominant society in the United States for as long as the United States has been in existence, and during the 60s was a hotbed of transition and refinement of the global system. This was the period where a lot of the individuals classified as black were not begging, were not asking. They were taken to the streets, tearing things up, turning up, having face-to-face, toe-to-toe, mano-a-mano clashes with local law enforcement. The government's resources, military resources, were being used and stretched thin, trying to put out fires. And in particular, the fires that I'm referring to, social unrest by way of counter-racist violence of people who were classified as black. And in particular in Washington, D.C., there were a meeting of the minds in a small underground pub. And the ancestors and the creator would have it that a young student at Howard, I mean, she may not have been a student, but I know she was young, and I'm saying she's young because she was younger than Dr. Neely Fuller Jr., who was a retired veteran. And Neely Fuller Jr. and Dr. Frances Cress Welsing were at a meeting where a lot of black people just went to a meeting. They saw a flyer, and it says, hey, we're going to try to solve the problem in Washington, D.C. of systematic anti-blackness, racism, white supremacy, white terror domination. So the who's who of the Washington, D.C. community all showed up. And my understanding, one of our infamous or famous politicians in Washington, D.C., Marion Barry, was actually at this gathering of motivated people classified as black in Washington, D.C. But there was a lot of talking, there was a lot of diatribes, there was a lot of preaching, there was a lot of prognosticating going on in this particular gathering of people classified as black in Washington, D.C., I believe in the 60s. And I apologize in advance one more again if I'm getting my times and dates wrong. But hey, this information needs to be consolidated and represented to people classified as black so that we know this history, because this history is extremely important to us as a group, because Dr. Frances Cress Welsing and Neely Fuller Jr. have provided us with the code, racism, white supremacy, what it is and how it works, and they've provided us with the why. Why do people who classify themselves as white seek to dominate non-white people, in particular people that they classify as black? Let's move on. So, Dr. Frances Cress Welsing and Neely Fuller Jr. are at the meeting, and Dr. Frances Cress Welsing has said in interviews that she overheard a man with a funny accent saying something about a system. At this time, nobody had ever presented the global system of anti-blackness, white terror domination, and or racism, white supremacy as a system that dominates all areas of people activity. And she overheard this man with a briefcase and a bunch of papers in his hand talking about a system, and she started listening, and she started inching closer and closer to this individual who she did not know, and she started asking questions. What do you mean a system of racism, white supremacy? What is the system of racism of white supremacy? How does it work? You understand me? And from those inquiries, from my understanding, they exchanged information. And we have to understand, Dr. Frances Cress Welsing was a young woman, and Neely Fuller was probably in his prime. And they could have got into a whole bunch of tacky interaction. But all they talked about from Dr. Frances Cress Welsing's testimony on a couple of interviews that I overheard, I heard her on, I believe on the Carl Nelson show, and on the context of white supremacy hosted by Gus T. Renegade, She said all they talked about was this system because she was extremely intrigued by this theory. This theory would later, as we understand it, motivate and inspire her to write her own paper, which placed her livelihood in jeopardy. The Cress theory on color confrontation. And this theory would state, it was an essay, the Cress theory of color confrontation, while assistant professor at Howard University. In the essay, she argued that the drive for white supremacy / superiority stems from a pervasive feeling of inadequacy and inferiority from people who classify themselves as white. Now, from that essay, the Cress theory of color confrontation, she then writes the book that, listen, it changed my life once I read it. She then wrote the book, The ISIS Papers, breaking down the keys to the colors. Now, I am speaking fast because this is a quick hitter episode, and I'm just giving a brief presentation on why I thought it was important to do this show on Dr. Frances Cress Welsing and Dr. Lisa D. Cook. You understand me? So back to Neely Fuller Jr. Once Dr. Frances Cress Welsing developed this relationship, this constructive relationship with Neely Fuller Jr., she suggested to Neely Fuller, you might want to put this in book form. Neely Fuller, write no books. You know, he wasn't even thinking about putting it in book form, but she said this really needs to be put in a book form. Our people really need this information, and if you need assistance, because I am in the area of education, I will assist you in writing the book. So from Neely Fuller's words, there would be no book. There would be no independent compensatory code had there not been Dr. Frances Cress Welsing. She helped him write it. She wrote the foreword. And she assisted him in all of the other areas of developing or producing his book, his piece of literature, which is extremely valuable to those of us who seek less confusion as it pertains to the global system of racism, white supremacy, what it is and how it works. And then once Neely Fuller finished the book, Dr. Frances Cress Welsing then produced her work called The ISIS Papers. So you have the what it is, and Dr. Neely Fuller produced what it is, and Dr. Frances produced why they do what they do. So we don't need to reinvent no doggone other wheels, but I will say Dr. Frances Cress Welsing is a warrior scholar because she placed her livelihood in jeopardy. She lost tenure at so-called black university, Howard University, because those people at Howard University told her, do not write about color confrontation. Do not write about white people and their inferiority complex. And she did it anyway. They removed her tenure, and she was removed from the university. Now, she could have made lots of money. Towing the line. And she didn't. She spent her life energy fighting. She spent her life energy informing. She spent her life energy being constructive. She spent her life energy as a warrior, and she deserved to be looked at as such by people who are subject to black classification and are victims of racism, white supremacy. But ain't nobody presenting the information. Here on People Activity Radio, we are duty bound to control the narrative. We are duty bound to tell our stories. We are duty bound to have passion about our group. And whoever it offends, oh well, so be it. It is what it is. Less move on. Worrying about offending nobody when it comes to our survival. When it comes to your survival, it is what it is. Whatever has to be done, has to be done. The decisions make themselves. But I digress. So, JohnGHorse, I thought you were supposed to be talking about Dr. Lisa Cook. Ain't no Dr. Lisa Cook without Dr. Frances Cress Welsing. You understand me? That's my point. See, this is a quick hitter episode. We're not going to draw it all out and spend all a long wind dissertation on trying to make you understand. I presented you with a source piece of information. Dr. Lisa D. Cook put her livelihood on the line. This is a well-accomplished economist, world-renowned, well-accomplished economist that could have been writing about anything else in the world, but people classified as black being targeted and victimized by people who classify themselves as white and believe in racism and white supremacy in the United States of America. You understand me? But she did it anyway. And for that, Dr. Lisa D. Cook, we give you a black self-respect salute. You are indeed a queen, mother, warrior. In the battle for justice and liberation of people who are subject to black classification in these United States of America. And for those of y'all who don't understand how accomplished Dr. Lisa D. Cook is, because she's still living and she's still out here, I'm going to read a portion of her bio. And it starts, and it reads, Dr. Lisa D. Cook is a professor in the Department of Economics and in International Relations at Michigan State University. As the first Marshall Scholar from Spelman College, she received a second BA from Oxford University in philosophy, politics, and economics. Dr. Cook earned a PhD in economics from the University of California, Berkeley. Among her current research interests are economic growth and development, financial institutions and markets, innovation, and economic history. She was a National Fellow of Stanford University and served in the White House as a senior economist at the Council of Economic Advisors under President Obama. She served as president of the National Economic Association and currently serves as director of the American Economic Association, the AEA, summer training program. She is a research associate of the National Bureau of Economic Research and a Sigma Chi Distinguished Lecturer. In 2019, she was elected to serve on the Economic Committee of the AEA, which is the American Economic Association. She is on the board of the editors of the Journal of Economic Literature, and her publications have appeared in other peer-reviewed journals, including the American Economic Review and the Journal of Economic Growth, Explorations in Economic History, and the Business History Review, as well as a number of books. Her research has been funded by the National Science Foundation, the Economic History Association, and Harvard Business School, among others. Dr. Cook has held positions or conducted postdoctoral research at the National Bureau of Economic Research, the Federal Reserve Banks of Minneapolis, New York, and Philadelphia, the World Bank, the Brookings Institution, the Hoover Institution, Stanford University, Solomon Brothers, now Citigroup, and C&S Bank, now Bank of America. She is a member of the Council of Foreign Relations, the Advisor Board of Opportunity Inclusive Growth Institution of Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis, the Advisory Board of the Lemelson Center for the Study of Invention and Innovation at the Smithsonian Institution, and the Board of Directors of the Roosevelt Institute. She received the Founders Prize for Best Paper in Social Science History in 2018, and the Impactful Mentor Award for mentoring graduate students from the AEA Mentoring Pipeline Program in 2019. Prior to this academic appointment, and while in faculty at Harvard University Kennedy School of Government, she was also Deputy Director of Africa Research and Programs at the Center of the International Development at Harvard University, was Managing Editor of the Harvard University World Economic Forum Africa Competitiveness Report, and contributed to the Making Markets work program at Harvard Business School with fellow economist and co-author Jeffrey Sachs. She advised the governments of Nigeria and Rwanda, and as a Council of Foreign Relations International Affairs Fellow, she was Senior Advisor on Finance and Development at the Treasury Department from 2000 to 2001. From November 2008 to January 2009, Dr. Cook was on the Obama presidential transition team and led the review of the World Bank and International Affairs Division of the Treasury Department. She speaks English, French, Russian, Spanish, and Wolof. Straight from her bio, the receipts, the stats are out. You understand me? This is the woman that put all that on the line to basically put together a compensatory, a quantifiable, researchable, receipt-filled presentation on why people subject to black classification in the United States of America are well overdue to be compensated from being targets of the federal government, local state governments, and whatever other institution that you want to call out in the United States of America for wholesale systematic mistreatment, for wholesale systematic stonewalling, etc., etc., yada, yada, yada. We coming to get our check. This is People Activity Radio, and I am JohnGHorse. And I hope that this presentation has removed confusion or created less confusion. I'm going to leave you with a clip from our elder, Neely Fuller Jr., because the whole presentation of the interview of Dr. Lisa D. Cook was basically a study of the effects of white terror domination in the United States of America, how it affected the innovative inspiration, the innovative productivity of people subject to black classification. You understand me? So without further ado, you know how we do it here on People Activity Radio. We're just gonna cue the clip.
Yes, the answer to the first question, the white supremacists, they practice killing each other. Killing is fun. You look at the entire culture of white supremacy. Mystery novels, detective novels, turn on television, explosions all over the place. They're not building anything. They're not teaching young people how to build anything. It's tearing up things. I mean, all of the video games is not about how to construct anything, not how to lay a railroad. That's boring. That is boring. You know, you turn on television and you're looking at people building railroads and how to go about doing it, and then how to make a locomotive come down that railroad track and not run off onto the side and whatnot and carry cargo from one place to another. Oh, no. You don't want a society that thinks like that. You just think like that if you're going to be carrying arms and shipments and whatnot to kill people. All of the heroes in the system of white supremacy are what? Killers. Julius Caesar. In order to get a job, you have to sit there and open a big book and study what Julius Caesar did and said. In order to what? In order to get food on your table. If you're a black person, you better learn about what Julius Caesar did. How many people he killed? How many people he was planning on killing? And Napoleon Bonaparte. What did he conquer? I mean, what did he do when he went among the people, the dark people there, in what we call Haiti and whatnot? Think about what old Napoleon did, and glorified, build some statues to him, put them in the town square. You say, well, we'd like to plant a garden where that statue is. No. Forget about eating food. Stand there and look at that statue of Napoleon and worship him. Now we got another one over here, Robert E. Lee. Go down and take a look at his statue. Spend a whole lot of money taking pictures and whatnot. And then go into a bookstore. Learn all about how to kill people and get away with it. The headless corpse, the body in the basement. Great big thick books, 500, 600 pages. I mean, expensive books. All about, the body in the trunk of the car. The body at the bottom of the lake. Murder at midnight. Who done it? All about killing. They worship it. And then when they get in touch with black people, they've been doing so much killing among themselves, they are experts at it. Practice makes perfect. That's a universal logical law. Anything that you practice, you'll become real good at it. That's why they laugh when black people start talking about, I'm going to take up some arms and whatnot. They say, hey, you fellas are Johnny-come-lately. You all don't know nothing about arms. We got arms you never even heard of. You wait until we put this on you. You are going to cry for mercy like you wouldn't believe in the first 15 minutes of what we can really turn loose on you when we really turn loose. So, they are real good at killing. That's the point that I'm making.
Neely Fuller Jr., straight no chaser, ball. And I hope I have contributed to less confusion. And always remember, keep learning and stay codified.
Economics, education, entertainment, labor, law, politics, religion, sex, and war. If you do not understand racism, which is white supremacy, what it is and how it works, everything else that you understand will only confuse you. Confuse you. Confuse you. Confuse you. Confuse you. If you do not understand, confuse you. If you do not understand, confuse you. If you do not understand, confuse you. Confuse you.
My definition of white supremacy and racism, I use those two terms as synonyms. I use the same definition for both terms. That definition is as follows: a global system of people who classify themselves as white and are dedicated to abusing and or subjugating everyone in the known universe whom they classify as not white.
Economics, education, entertainment, labor, law, politics, religion, sex, and war.